What you're looking at is an icon of Saint George, currently located in the Church of Saint Mercurius in Old Cairo. Saint George is one of the most popular saints in Coptic Orthodox iconography, and Christian iconography in general for that matter. Whether the icon is from Ethiopia, Greece, Russia, or Egypt, he's generally portrayed astride a horse, spearing some sort of foe, usually a serpent or a dragon. According to Christian tradition, St. George was a Roman soldier in the province of Asia Minor who was martyred under the reign of Emperor Diocletian. But according to Coptic Orthodox tradition, St. George never stopped being involved with Christian communities, even after his martyrdom. How does that work? Well, it was believed he was active by means of his icons. Consider, for example, the History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, a text compiled over the course of centuries that tells the history of the Coptic Orthodox Church. Some of the most curious stories in this text are about miracle-working icons. Icons that are not just works of art, but active participants, helping the Christian communities of Egypt. In one story, an icon of Jesus starts to ooze blood. The local Christians, after collecting the blood, find that it can cure disease. Other stories tell of icons reaching out from their frame and wiping away disease. In this text, the icons of St. George are among the most active miracle workers. His icons weep tears of sadness when the Christian community goes astray. Other times, his icons glow with divine light. In one story, in keeping with St. George being a soldier, there's a dramatic moment when the saint even strikes a man dead for attacking one of his icons. These stories might be surprising, considering that it's easy to view icons as merely works of art, but in the world of Christian iconography, a picture is never simply a picture. They are believed to be the threshold where one can encounter the saint and interact with the saint's presence. Today we'll examine the protecting image of St. George, how his iconographic tradition developed in ancient Christianity, and what these traditions can reveal about how ancient Christians viewed the miraculous power of saintly iconography. Scholars typically refer to this motif as the Holy Rider or the Rider Saint, and at least in antiquity, the Holy Rider was often not St. George. Take, for example, this bronze amulet from Western Asia Minor, probably dating to the 3rd century CE. On one side, we see our familiar Holy Rider. He's dressed like a soldier, armed with a spear, has a halo around his head, and he's accompanied by an angel as an escort. The soldier saint attacks some sort of demonic figure here on the ground. The Greek inscription names both the hero and the foe. Angel Araph, flee, O hated one, Solomon pursues you. So here the Holy Rider is King Solomon, the famous son of King David from the Hebrew Bible, and the enemy is not a serpent or a dragon, but a named human-shaped demon. Solomon in late antique Christian tradition became famous for his role as a protector and his authority over demons. Thus, he's commonly named on protective amulets such as this one. But he's not the only Holy Rider. Let's consider another example. What you're looking at here is a copper alloy amulet dating somewhere between the 5th and 7th centuries that was probably produced in Syria. You can see here on one side the Holy Rider motif, a soldier, a halo around his head, armed with a spear, stabbing some sort of foe on the ground. On one side it reads in Greek, Lord, help. And on the other side, the identity of the Holy Rider is revealed, Saint Sicinius. Saint Sicinius is not nearly as famous as Saint George, but apparently he was one of the primary protective saints for late antique Christians, appearing everywhere on protective gems and amulets. But looking at all these examples of the Holy Rider, you may have noticed that these are small, personal ritual objects, and even more so, they are all ritual objects that we could classify as magical. Now, scholars find the category magic very problematic, maybe even inaccurate, but the words amulet, charm, or talisman at least evoke connotations of an object that was believed to leverage supernatural power for personal protection. So where do icons fit in? We're most familiar with the Holy Rider as St. George in ecclesiastical settings, like in a church or a monastery. In Egypt, you can find rider saint icons on the walls of the Hanging Church in Cairo, or painted on the walls of the monastery of St. Paul the Anchorite near the shores of the Red Sea. But especially when we're talking about antiquity, we should not necessarily make a clear-cut distinction between the realm of personal ritual and the realm of ecclesiastical ritual. The Holy Rider could jump across these ritual contexts. Consider, for example, one of the most remarkable depictions of the Holy Rider ever found, a fresco painted on one of the walls of the monastery of Apa Apollo. Located halfway between Asyut and Minya, just west of the Nile, the monastery of Apa Apollo has produced some remarkable examples of ancient Christian iconography, many of which are housed in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Painted in one of the monastery chapels, archaeologists discovered a very familiar looking fresco, a rider saint armed with a spear and shield attacking a female demon. The saint is labeled in Coptic as Saint Sicinius, and the demon is labeled Alabastria. This name likely refers to the same demon on that amulet from Asia Minor that we mentioned before, who goes by different names, including Araf, Abizu, or Gilu. Based on the iconography, it appears that the monks commissioned this fresco for similar reasons that someone might wear a Holy Rider amulet, to protect individuals from harm. These images off to the side, scorpions, snakes, and weaponry, evoke similar iconography on late antique amulets. For example, here's a late antique bronze amulet depicting the evil eye being attacked by snakes, lions, a scorpion, and being pierced with arrows, a nearly identical motif found in the monastery fresco of St. Sicinius. Now, this is not to say Holy Rider iconography originated from the realm of magical ritual, but rather it's evidence that ancient Christians, laity and clergy alike, recognized the Holy Rider as an agent of protection. In the case of small personal amulets, the protection that St. Sicinius brings is intimately personal. Someone probably wore him around their neck as a necklace, based on this hole here that was meant for some sort of string or chain. In the example from the monastery of Upper Apollo, the Holy Rider is a professionally rendered fresco that may have been painted on the wall to protect an entire community. I think these examples make stories about miracle-working iconography more intelligible. By the time the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria was first being compiled, Christians in Egypt had already been relying on images of the Holy Rider for protection for hundreds of years. The images of saints were viewed as an efficacious way to bring about healing or protection against harm. I argue this is partly because the images themselves were believed to embody the personhood of the saint himself. In other words, carrying an image of a saint in your pocket or around your neck meant that the saint was with you physically. For example, the Christian bishop Theodoret, who lived in northern Syria in the 5th century, records a striking personal example in his book called Historia Religiosa. He claims a demon attempted to attack him at night, but retreated when it saw a choir of the martyrs protecting him. At first, Theodoret was confused what the demon meant by choir of the martyrs, but he later realized that the demon was referring to a cloak from a holy man named James that Theodoret kept by his bed, as well as a flask of oil gathered from very many martyrs. By this, Theodoret is probably referring to a pilgrimage flask filled with oil that had come into contact with the relic of a saint. Many examples are known from the pilgrimage site of St. Manos near Alexandria. These objects were regarded as retaining the personhood of past martyrs. All of this talk of saints that heal, weep, bleed, or fight by means of material objects leads us to a curious theoretical concept that religious studies scholars have been exploring over the past few decades: object agency. Generally speaking, we think of agency as something humans possess. We humans have intentionality. We make decisions at every moment of every day that affect ourselves and others around us. Thus, we have agency. Scholars use the term object agency to refer to how objects shape the world we live in, and how we respond to those objects. This draws from the research of the British anthropologist Alfred Gell, who highlighted how objects trigger reactions from us. He writes that objects cause us to feel happy, angry, fearful, or lustful. They have an impact, and we as artists produce them as ways of distributing elements of our own efficacy in the form of things. By this, Gell means objects enable someone's agency to be distributed beyond the person. Kind of like how someone might say a famous writer has literary immortality. Although William Shakespeare is long dead, his literary works extend past his life, affecting the world to this day. In a similar way, an iconographer can be said to have distributed agency through one's icons. Dozens of icons today in the churches of Old Cairo were created by the Armenian iconographer Yuhanna al-Armani in 18th century Ottoman Egypt. Although Yuhanna al-Armani has not left much for historians to study in terms of historical records, his icons still affect how people experience these churches to this day, so we can say he has agency distributed through these objects. But even more than that, as we've been examining in this video, throughout history, many viewed icons as embodying the holy figures that they represent. The icons were treated as social agents, treated as part of the community, treated as being able to help the community through miracles. Based on those stories, I have no doubt that the monks of Appa Apollo regarded this fresco as an extension of Saint Socinius and understood that the saint himself was present in the monastery, offering his protective power and presence to the monks. Now, all this theorizing might sound very abstract, but the whole point of this theoretical lens is to alert us to a very concrete phenomenon: how people are affected by objects and how they interact with objects. If we view icons as inert works of art, just sitting there hanging on a wall, we might be liable to misunderstand a dizzying array of traditions surrounding these objects, stretching back to the earliest centuries of Christianity, traditions that ascribed agency to icons.